President Trump claims that a planned attack on Iran was halted after the Islamic regime canceled mass public execution of protesters. But behind the seeming calm, warships are moving, cash is fleeing, and threats are still flying. So why did everyone back down from an Iran confrontation? And is it all a diversion from what's coming? This week's Jerusalem Minute begins now. Imagine owning your own luxury apartment in the heart of Jerusalem. The Dream Raffle is making that possible with a $1.2 million fully furnished apartment as the grand prize. And right now, there's one final bonus round. Purchase tickets by February 2nd, and you'll be entered into a raffle for a $15,000 cash prize. Click the link below and buy your tickets today. Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News. I am in Jerusalem at the JNS Media Hub. Alex Trayman, CEO of JNS. He is down in South Florida, spending the weekend at the Israeli-American Council Conference. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Alex, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you, Josh.
Top story, and you were there in Florida at the conference several days ago, where Special Envoy to the U.S. administration, Steve Witkoff, discussed the escalating situation with Iran. As of today, the United States has not unleashed any sort of strike against Iran. This, of course, following all the protests taking place in that country over the last 2+ weeks, with reports of thousands and thousands of people who have been killed by the regime. Before we get to anything else, let's go to that video of Witkoff.
President Trump warned the Iranians, and at his direction, we communicated with the Iranians yesterday, and one of the things we were concerned about were the killings that were rumored to be on the way. Hangings, mass hangings, and that's been shut down.
Do you think we'll see some kind of military action?
Well, I hope there's a diplomatic resolution. I really do. There are 4 issues: nuclear enrichment, missiles. They have to cut back on their inventory. The actual material that they have, which is roughly 2,000 kilograms, which is enriched anywhere between 3.67% and 60%, and the proxies, of course, and I think if Iran, which is stumbling in their economy, it's a pretty serious situation. There's no water there 16 hours a day. There's no electric 12 hours a day. Inflation is probably well north of 50%. That's a lot of problems. So I think if they want to come back to the League of Nations, if we can solve those 4 problems diplomatically, then that would be a great resolution. And I think the alternative is a bad one.
So, Alex, there you have Special Envoy Witkoff. You heard him in person. Did the United States miss the opportunity to strike when the kettle was hot?
No, I don't think that the United States missed the opportunity, per se, to strike in Iran. And there's a lot of questions about whether the United States will use military force, and if they do, when they might use military force. I think this is a long story, and I know that we're in this 24/7 media echo chamber, and we want to see results happen quickly. You know, revolutions take a long time to develop. The president has been very open, stating that if the Iranian regime will take out protesters in the streets, as they have been doing and continue to do, that there would be military backing for those protesters. Does that mean that Trump missed the opportunity by not going when the iron was so hot, as you mentioned? No, I don't think so. And again, I think the considerations are several, as I mentioned. First of all, if this regime can fall without a military intervention, I think that is by far for the United States option number one. Like, they want the Iranian people to do this. They want this to be known as an Iranian people's revolution and not a U.S. overthrow of the Iranian regime. There's a long and sordid history between Iran and the United States. There is a narrative about the United States overthrowing Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953. And a lot of the Iranian experts that I talked to say that this had nothing to do really with the United States. It wasn't a U.S.-led or British-led coup per se, but that's the narrative, and the president doesn't want to get caught up in that narrative, number one. So if the Iranian people can do this themselves, and this is a people's revolution, that's better. If the United States has to come in and support, and they might, and they do need backing, the Iranian protesters definitely want to know that they have the backing of the United States. I think that the president of the United States has been very clear on it. Even last night, he said that it's time for a new regime in Iran. So the protesters are getting that moral support that they need from the United States. If there's going to be a strike in Iran, I think there's a lot of considerations just with when and how. If the United States is going to attack, they want to attack in a way that's going to be decisive and definitive. If you look at recent military action by the United States, first you can look back to the attacks on the Fordo nuclear reactor. That was a one and done operation. They launched 12 B-2 bombers to fly over and to bomb Fordo, and that was the end of the military action. And that didn't just happen in a vacuum, and it wasn't initiated just by the United States. Remember that Israel had already done the dirty work of clearing the airspace and hitting all the targets. And then when the president of the United States understood that that operation could be successful, he launched the operation. Now, that operation was not drawn up on the 2 days' notice. That was an operation that the United States military had been practicing for years. They were using weapons specifically designed for that location. Those massive ordnance penetrator bombs were specifically designed to bomb the Fordo nuclear reactor under the mountain. So they had developed special weapons. They had practiced dry runs for this for many years. And when the conditions were perfect, that's when they launched the operation. And if you look also at the military intervention, the special ops operation in Caracas to take out Maduro, that was an operation that they were practicing for months. And they specifically waited until the conditions were correct, including waiting even for the right weather. So there was a lot that went into developing the plans, the military plans, and also deciding precisely when the conditions were correct to launch them. So I think that the same thing is here. It could be that either they don't have plans and they're making them, or it could be that they have some plans and they might be waiting for Khamenei to be in a specific place at a specific time. You can also remember back to Israel famously taking out Hassan Nasrallah when they knew that he was going to be in a specific underground bunker and launching a specific operation to take out basically a whole city block to get him underneath those buildings where they knew he was going to be. And they specifically launched the operation because they had intelligence that he was going to leave that facility. So you don't know exactly what the U.S. has in mind by a military strike. And if they do strike, they want it to be decisive and definitive so that they don't have to then get engaged in a longer military operation. They want it to be definitive, decisive, and the story to be over with. And yet there's even another consideration. The consideration is who will be the next day? Who will be running Iran the day after such a strike takes place? And I've gotten some indications from members of the U.S. administration that they might not consider Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, the son of the Shah, who was exiled during the revolution of 1978, 1979. They don't necessarily consider Pahlavi to be the answer to run Iran on the day after, even though he's definitely pro-Western, definitely pro-America, definitely pro-Israel. Like from an ideological perspective, he's perfect. But the question is, does he have the support inside Iran to run the country? And I think that the intelligence estimates right now are that people are not yet rallying behind him, or that he would not have the strength and the force to hold that country together if the regime was toppled. So if you go out and you take out Khamenei, for example, and then the country falls, whether to another strongman who's part of the Basij or the Revolutionary Guards, or to Marxists on the other hand, then what have you accomplished, right? So you have to also make sure that the conditions are there. So it could very well be that the United States is waiting to see whether key members of the Revolutionary Guards are willing to turn on the regime. And if there is another player that the United States has identified that they prefer to be the strong man to take over Iran after Khamenei. So I think that there's a lot of considerations here, but I also think that this is a long story. And just because a strike didn't happen this past week doesn't mean that a strike can't happen next week or the week after. The key is just that this protest movement continue to push forward and that pressure continues to mount towards a revolution. And you're seeing more and more coverage on television, on American news, by the way, as the president continues to make statements. You're seeing, like I was watching on Fox last night here in Florida, a lot of coverage about Iran, which is something that is much more than it was just a few weeks back. So if the pressure mounts and the support in the United States for military intervention mounts and the conditions all line up, you might see something happen in the near future.
That's a lot to take in, of course, Alex. Let's bring in another angle here. Reports in the New York Times several days ago indicating that even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu perhaps asked the United States, the Trump administration, not to carry out a strike against Iran at this juncture. And you had Amit Segel, a pundit, well-known journalist here in Israel, talk about the speculation here, listing 3 reasons why potentially that attack did not happen. He said perhaps there's a lack of interceptors to thwart Iranian retaliation. Again, this is looking at it from an Israeli perspective as to why Netanyahu perhaps encouraged an attack not to happen now. The second is the strike was going to be symbolic and not worth the fallout. And the third is this is a deception, which you were alluding to lull the Iranians into thinking the U.S. will not attack. So perhaps Netanyahu himself asking President Trump not to strike Iran at this juncture.
Well, I want to address the New York Times article and the question of whether Netanyahu, pushed back against an American attack. I think that's more important, but I do think it is important to address even some of the reasons that might have been mentioned by Amit Segel, because I think that they give a lot of context. I don't necessarily think that Amit Segel thinks that that's what happened, but there is a lot of context here. If there's going to be a military intervention, you can be almost assured that Israel will be a prime target for a retaliation. There are questions about Israel's missile defense. I believe fully that Israel is preparing for this scenario, has prepared for such a scenario. I think that some of this protest movement is sparked by efforts on the ground by the Mossad. So I don't think that Israel would have put such efforts into motion if they didn't feel that they had the capabilities to knock down incoming ballistic missiles. But yes, Iran is likely to fire whatever ballistic missiles it has left. And the estimates are that Israel took out maybe half of the 3,000 estimated ballistic missiles that they had prior during that 12-day war, which means that they have over 1,000, if not 1,500 ballistic missiles left. And Israel needs to be able to shoot down 1,500 ballistic missiles. And you could be certain that Iran will try to fire as much as they can, as fast as they can, specifically if they think that this is their final moment and they're never going to need them again, that this is the time. If they're going to go down, that they're going to take Israel down with them. And I know that in the last several days prior to Trump, stepping back from the ledge, and prior to this report in the New York Times, that Israel was preparing the home front, and there was a lot of people in Israel that believed that we were going to be in an imminent war with Iran, and that war might still be right around the corner. So certainly, the missile defense issue is a very, very serious issue. I think that Netanyahu did not call up the president of the United States and tell him, don't take out the head of the snake. Okay. When we talk about what a total victory is, and you look at all of maybe the head of octopus, the terror octopus is a better term. You look at all the tentacles that have attacked Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the tentacles in Syria. If you want the octopus to die, you've got to cut out the head of the snake, the head of the terror octopus. And I think that Netanyahu and Israel believe that total victory only comes with the fall of this regime. So I think for Netanyahu, even if Israel is going to be on the opposite end of a retaliation or an attempted retaliation, this is a war. And unfortunately, the the ends justify the means here. So you have to be ready and willing to absorb that. I don't think that Netanyahu gave that report, that order, and I don't believe reports that come from the New York Times that have anonymous sources, and it's just so ridiculous because if Trump launched an attack, the New York Times would be running a story that said that Netanyahu pushed Trump for the attack, right? So it's never, it's always about Israel. If there is an attack, it's because of Israel. If there isn't an attack, it's because of Israel. Next week, the president of the United States might attack Iran, and then it will be because of Israel, even though last week it was that Netanyahu said, don't do it, and Trump didn't do it because of Netanyahu. So I think that every story that comes out, is about Netanyahu. They always want to try to project and create a rift between the president of the United States and the prime minister of Israel. It's always about the Jews, no matter what. So, that's what these stories are. And you just gotta, every time you see a story about Netanyahu doing this, or a rift between Trump and Netanyahu, or somebody in the U.S. administration saying they don't like what Netanyahu is doing. Okay, that is a campaign. It's a media campaign that may or may not be backed by the truth, or it might just be one person's opinion of what happened, but really not indicative of the policy of the president of the United States or the prime minister of Israel.
Alex, taking a look at the protesters and the protests taking place, the demonstrators there in Iran. Yesterday, you had the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, accusing Israel and the United States of actually being behind the protest movement, as if both entities have agents on the ground there. And the Ayatollah saying that those are the people that his regime, his government is targeting. Let's take a look at that video.
ما رئیس جمهور آمریکا رو مجرم می‌دانیم، هم به خاطر تلفات، هم به خاطر خسارات، هم به خاطر تهمتی که به ملت ایران زد. ما بنا نداریم کشور رو به طرف جنگ ببریم، اما مجرمان داخلی رو هم رها نمی‌کنیم.
So there you have propaganda from the Ayatollah, from the Iranian regime, accusing agents of the U.S. and Israel of being behind those demonstrations in Iran, as if the Iranians were warranted in using excessive violence, killing thousands, because in their minds and their warped propaganda here, it is Israel and the U.S. behind the protest movement.
Well, first of all, if it's the United States and Israel that are doing this, then why are you shooting your own people, right? Then the Iranian people are innocent, and the guilty parties are the United States and Israel. And they're not shooting at the United States or Israel. They're shooting at their own people, okay? And that's the first indication that this protest movement is coming from the people themselves. Now, this isn't the first attempt by the Iranian people at an intervention here, at a revolution. They've been trying repeatedly in the last several years. In fact, just 2 years ago, they came out into the streets. Back in 2008, they were out in the streets, and the United States and Israel did not back them publicly. So, the people are looking for that backing. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that the Mossad has people on the ground inside Iran. I mean, we've just seen that over and over again. I think the greatest example of that was when Israel lifted out the archives of the Iranian nuclear program several years back. And certainly there was reports that in the very beginning of the 12-day war that agents on the ground took out some of the air defenses. And, maybe later we'll get in books the history of Israel's presence inside Iran. And there's no doubt that there's Israeli agents there. There's no doubt that Israeli agents are helping leaders of the protest movement destabilize inside Iran. I think that that's correct. But to blame the whole thing on Israel and America, well, that's what they've been saying all the time. Death to America, death to Israel. They've made these two powers, the big Satan and the little Satan, the enemies, for decades. And it's just a deflection against the fact that there's not water for the people in Iran, that the rial, the currency in Iran is like 1.4 million rial to a single dollar. Okay. And the fact that this regime spends the money that it has, when they're selling oil to China, okay, and when and they're spending that money to provide weapons to Russia, number one, and then they are spending that money to fund Hezbollah in Lebanon, to fund Hezbollah in Latin America, including in Venezuela, to fund Hamas, to fund the Houthis. And the Iranian people are like, what's going on over here? Iran using their dollars to build an illicit nuclear weapons program. So they're using all the technology to build nuclear weapons and build ballistic missiles instead of using the technology to figure out how to get water for their people. So there's no doubt and no reason why the Iranian people would not want to rise up against these fanatical clerics, the head of this terror octopus, when they're the ones suffering as a result. It's not like this is Qatar, which has endless funds, that all the people are there are wealthy, and then they're using money to do whatever they want, and the people don't care. The people in Iran are suffering at the hands of this republic, this Islamic republic, and they will just want normalcy. They want to be one of the normal countries of the world. They don't want their passport to be worthless. They don't want the currency in their pocket to be totally worthless. They're sick of what the Ayatollahs have brought them, which is just really death and destruction since they've been in office in 1979. And they want to return back to this is a people that has a very bold culture. It's an intelligent people, and they've been really repressed by this regime. So I think that this is a people's movement. But obviously the Ayatollahs, they don't want the people to know that. They don't want you to know that. That's most important. They don't want you to know that in America. They want Americans to think that this has nothing to do with the Iranian people, that it only has to do with Israel, that it only has to do with America.
So I'm going to go back to the original question which we started with. Will there be a strike on Iran? And even with the fact that it hasn't happened yet, there's still indications that it is possible. It could happen tonight, tomorrow, the days ahead, weeks ahead. You have the USS Abraham Lincoln and her carrier strike group making its way to the Middle East from the South China Sea. The reports indicating that senior regime officials, including the son of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, transferred $1.5 billion over the past several days to accounts outside of the country. Here it says in Dubai. So all these indications still indicate we are still on high alert. Even if not officially, the Home Front Command here in Israel, for example, has not changed any of its directives. But that being said, people are still kind of cautiously looking up to the sky in the evenings, thinking at any moment things could change just like that, and the president could go ahead and strike Iran.
I think that's exactly right. In Israel, you don't have to create too much readiness. The Israeli public is generally ready. The safe rooms, can be opened on a moment's notice. Israelis can get 10 minutes, and get to the safe rooms if that's what they need to get to. You do see the United States moving assets. They have to be prepared. If there is a strike, even one that's intended to be decisive and definitive, there can be all kinds of results that occur, intended consequences, unintended consequences, and you have to be ready. You have to be ready to go in with whatever you have. So the United States is moving assets, and it could very well be that they don't want to strike until their assets are fully in place. There's also questions about whether the Qataris are willing to let the United States use their airbase for strikes on Iran, because remember, after Operation Midnight Hammer, the retaliation was against Qatar. Now, this is a U.S. airbase, so the Qataris should not have any veto over what the United States can do with the United States airbase in Qatar. If they have some kind of a veto over the United States action coming from that airbase, which is located in Qatar, then the United States should very strongly consider moving that airbase from Qatar, because the whole purpose of a U.S. airbase being there is that the U.S. can use it for whatever it needs whenever it needs it. And the Qataris are not supposed to have any veto over U.S. military activity coming from that airbase. So that's another potential consideration. But I do think that a strike is likely. I also think that the belief that a strike is likely is very important for the Iranians. And again, we heard Steve Witkoff. He said at the IAC here just 2 nights ago that a diplomatic solution is better than a military solution. I think that still for the United States, even if it is willing and able to launch a military intervention, that if this can happen without a military intervention, if the people can take over if you can see defections from the Revolutionary Guards and you don't need an intervention for the United States and for everybody, that's best. And that probably also would mean that you don't have a military retaliation on Israel. So there's all kind of considerations here. We just have to wait and watch. I do think that there is a likelihood of a strike against Iran, and that likelihood, and that pressure is very important to give wind to the sails of the Iranian protesters.
Alex, if we can, I'd like to move on to Gaza now and stick with Steve Witkoff. He sent out a long tweet several days ago indicating, on behalf of President Trump, we are announcing the launch of Phase 2 of the president's 20-point plan to end the Gaza conflict, moving from ceasefire to demilitarization, technocratic governance, reconstruction, announcing the establishment here of this transitional technocratic Palestinian administration, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the NCAG. So announcing Phase 2, and at the same time, President Trump announcing this Board of Peace. So listing in detail all of the different nominees, the representatives here, all the different branches, all the different committees. So it looks like even though Israel still has one Israeli hostage believed to be murdered by Hamas, Ran Gvili, still there in Gaza, it looks like the U.S. is officially moving to Phase 2.
Yeah, I want to talk about Phase 2 in a second, but I'll interject here just to talk about the IAC, because two of the parties that you just mentioned in your question were at the IAC, first being Steve Witkoff, the second being the family of Ran Gvili. They were at the IAC. The family there, remember, the family was also at Mar-a-Lago when the president and the prime minister was there. And you can know that for Israel, it is essential to get back this last body, and it's just amazing how Israel would go to such great lengths to recover even the body of someone that we understand is dead, at the end of this conflict. But nobody's going to rest until Ran Gvili's body is home, and we had chants here at the IAC, bring Ronnie home, bring Ronnie home, bring Ronnie home. Those were led by the parents of Omer Nutra. There was a number of different families here of hostages. I did a panel on the United Nations, which was featured Gilad Erdan, who was former ambassador to the UN, but also Ayelet Samrano, who is mother of Yonatan Samrano, whose son Yonatan was murdered on October 7th, escaping the Nova Festival, got all the way to Kibbutz Be'eri in a car at the same time as a terrorist, was shot dead. But then an UNRWA worker kidnapped, took the body, the murdered body of Yonatan Samrano in a UNRWA vehicle back over to Gaza. So, Ran Gvili's parents there, getting him back is really important. Steve Witkoff was also there. He was part of the opening plenary. There's a few things about Witkoff. I mean, first of all, the parents of the hostages are very, very appreciative. Doron Peretz, whose son Daniel was killed on October 7th and his body taken back into Gaza, was there. And he talked about how important it was that you had a Jew like Steve Witkoff inside the administration, and Witkoff, who had lost a son, understanding the pain of the parents and putting a lot of effort into getting the hostages back. And the U.S. definitely prioritized. The president prioritized getting those hostages back. I remember I was in the White House back in February in the Oval Office, asked a question to the president of the United States about the Palestinian Authority and whether they should be designated as a terrorist organization. And the president just answered the question by talking over and over about the hostages. So to him, it was extremely important. Obviously, to Witkoff, it was extremely important. And the results of getting the hostages back, really proved themselves. At the same time, you had Witkoff on the stage kind of jesting about how the president keeps telling Witkoff how fortunate he is to be, quote, in the employ of the president, and that Witkoff didn't even know where the Black Sea was prior to being appointed to this post. And so you have a guy that when he's on the stage, doesn't really seem that confident or impressive, or, have the breadth of knowledge that you would expect from somebody that's dealing with the Gaza portfolio, that's dealing with the Iran portfolio, that's trying to negotiate a settlement between Russia and Ukraine. And this is like the main guy, basically operating as like the assistant Secretary of State for the United States, having no prior diplomatic experience. And this is the guy here that's making these announcements that seem to be existential to Israel about whether you're going to have a military intervention or a diplomatic solution in Iran, or moving into phase two in the Gaza Strip. And this phase two, I think it leaves a lot of question marks for Israel. First of all, there's the sense that it's somewhat meaningless because nobody really believes that Hamas is going to disarm at this point, and nobody believes that this board of peace or this technocratic government that's being put into place is going to disarm Hamas. And if Hamas is not disarmed, you're not going to see Israel withdraw from additional land that they control. They control 53% of the Gaza Strip, and they're not going to withdraw any further as long as Hamas is still there. Now, the president wants to get wins, and so they're announcing this board of peace. Now, the board of peace itself, has a lot of red flags for Israel. Israel does not want Turkey to be part of this board of peace, and you have the foreign minister of Turkey, Foreign Minister Fidan, put onto the board of peace, and by all assessments from the people that I talked to, this is the heir apparent to Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey. And everybody that I speak to says that he's just as extreme, if not more extreme than Erdogan. So somebody more extreme than Erdogan, who's the potential next leader of Turkey, is now on the board of peace, deciding, having a vote on what would be the future of the Gaza Strip. It's very disappointing for Israel. And you actually saw the prime minister come out, and this is very uncommon in this last period, where the prime minister Israel came out with a statement saying that this goes against the policy of the state of Israel, the makeup of this board of peace. So, seeing this shift in the policy, I think is a major, major red flag here. You always saw until now on the policy level, in the statements between the president and the prime minister, that there was zero daylight between the two administrations. I'm not saying that there wasn't disagreements. Always were disagreements, but always handled behind closed doors. Now you're seeing all of a sudden, for the first time, an actual rift, an actual signal of a disagreement between the president and the prime minister bubbling out into public. And I think that this also goes back to the people that are making these announcements here, which is Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. And the feeling that Kushner and Witkoff are not, and we talked about this last week, are not in the pro-Netanyahu camp. And that was exactly why the prime minister flew into Mar-a-Lago to meet directly with the president of the United States and to try to get onto the same page as the president. Now you're seeing that the president's still giving this portfolio over to Witkoff and Kushner to move the process forward. What will be the actual mandate? Like, we saw the whole charter of this, executive council or the board of peace. There's a lot of different levels of this, whatever this is. You have the board of peace, you have the executive council, you have the technocratic government. What each one is going to do, we don't exactly know. The technocratic government, they're expected to try to get water running and sewage running, and to get the basic services up and running. But who is it being run by? It's being run by a former minister in the government of the Palestinian Authority. So Israel didn't want to see the Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza on the day after. They didn't want to see Qatar or Turkey on the board of peace. But that is exactly what's happening. And at the same time, as I mentioned in the beginning, this could very well be just a symbolic, appointments. There's a lot of terms about how you get on the board of peace, how you get out of the board of peace, who gets to vote in the board of peace, what they get to vote on, what they're going to do. It could be that it's nothing more than, just like a gigantic show that might not change almost anything on the ground. But to me, ultimately, the main thing that could come out of any of this would be if the Gazan people that want to leave the Strip actually get to leave. To me, that's the most important thing. And if the board of peace can't do that, I think that you're going to have Gazan residents just stewing in their own sewage, I think, which has been created by Hamas on October 7th and the resulting Israeli military operation for a long time.
Alex, you mentioned the Gavili family and everyone there chanting that Iran should be released by Hamas. A report came out over the last couple of days that Islamic Jihad, that terrorist organization, is actually holding the body of Ron Gvili of blessed memory. At the same time, I actually personally had the opportunity to speak to Ron's mother, Talik Gvili, last week in the Knesset at a conference, and she spoke very strongly in terms of what Israel should or should not be doing in order to get the body of her son returned. She said no aid to Gaza whatsoever until her son's body is returned, no rebuilding. She even said no to phase two. We shouldn't move anywhere at this juncture until Hamas is forced to release his body.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that a lot of Israelis feel that way. Hamas is supposed to return all the bodies, living and dead. They have refused to return the body of Ron Gvili when apparently it is known where his body is. Israel demonstrating that they have specific intelligence to where his body is located. Hamas, refusing. Fortunately, I mean, they're refusing to do it to a dead body, which is definitely a level better than not returning a live body. But still, how important it is to get the body of Ron Gvili back home so you can have a proper closure and a proper funeral. The parents are suffering, and the entire nation's suffering until he's back. So extremely important. I gave a speech to a federation, an update, and there was somebody. It was a staff member of the federation that he said to me, definitely like more liberal Jew, which is plenty of liberal Jews in America. Yes, and I got a lot of great questions. And one of the questions I got, he said to me, it's very hard sometimes to defend Israel when you have ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, making statements, about how there shouldn't be any food in Gaza, there shouldn't be any aid, and how do we defend Israel when ministers are making those statements? Well, here you see the parents of Ron Gvili. Like, this isn't a minister making some kind of like hyperbole statement that the family is saying. And I think a lot of Israelis saying, why are you rebuilding Gaza if Hamas is not returning the bodies? Hamas, as part of this agreement, is supposed to disarm itself, and Gaza is supposed to be completely demilitarized. Hamas is not disarmed. Okay. Gaza is not demilitarized. And so why are you moving forward with phase two? Now, meanwhile, like, we've only seen humanitarian aid go into Gaza. We haven't seen any kind of rebuilding. Now, you have questions here about who's pushing it, right? On the one hand, symbolic. On the other hand, you got to look again at Kushner and Witkoff. Good question. Is Kushner and Witkoff, are they going to be profiting from rebuilding? Like, are companies that they're involved with going to get major contracts in order to get this rebuilding started in Gaza? If that's the case, if Kushner and Witkoff or companies that they're engaged with are going to financially benefit from the rebuilding of Gaza, that would actually explain why they're in such a rush, because they're only in office as long as Trump is in office. Okay, so they got to get the ball rolling on this, because if contracts are not signed and they're not able to broker them over the next 2.5 or so years, then they're out of the game. So, they want to see all this rebuilding happen. And even if it's not a monetary conflict of interest, even though I think anybody should be asking that question, the Kushner and Witkoff do a lot of business with the Qataris. And now the Qataris are on that board of peace. They're doing business in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis could be involved here also. So you have these questions about conflict of interest, but even if it's not a financial conflict of interest, if they want to see this be their legacy, right? So they want all this stuff done, and they know they have a limited timeline to get it done. So they're trying to move it forward. But for Israel, we're going to be in the Middle East for much longer than Kushner and Witkoff are going to be in the Middle East. We got to make sure that we're operating to protect Israel's safety, not just for the next 2.5+ years when the Trump administration is in office, but well beyond when the Trump administration goes down in the history books and there's a new president of the United States.
Alice, I'm going to switch gears here. Last week, we talked about Prime Minister Netanyahu and the fact that he said he would like to end U.S. foreign assistance to the Jewish state. And as he did so, just this week, the U.S. Congress passed the State Department's funding bill, which includes at least $3.3 billion under the Foreign Military Financing Program for the State of Israel. So it looks like, at least in the short term, the funding is still going to be earmarked for Israel, even though Prime Minister Netanyahu said he would like that to be cut back, or if not shut off entirely, over the next few years.
Right. Well, this is still part of the existing 10-year, $38 billion MOU, right? There's a contract between Israel and the United States. The Congress is supposed to pass this aid. And I would say that until this MOU runs out, that Israel has got to do everything in their power to rebuild their military capabilities, especially ammunition, missile defense, as much as possible. Can Israel do it without the $3.3 billion that was approved now, which comes in addition to a $500 million that was approved previously? Yeah, they can do it. But the United States has an obligation under a contract to provide this, so they're doing that. I would definitely, as we talked about last week, you'd like to see Israel and the United States work out some kind of a different arrangement for the future, so that Israel is no longer reliant on this funding. But I think it's also important to note that for all the people that want to know, like, why is Israel getting this handout, that it's not a handout. Okay, that it's actually a subsidy for the United States military industry, because 100% of that $3.3 billion that just got approved, 100% of that $38 billion that Israel gets from the United States has to be spent in the United States. Not only that, when Israel has no choice but to spend the money in the United States, that means that Israel can't go to the open market to buy weapons. And not only that, but the United States has a veto over military contracts that Israel has with the acquisition of weapons. So it means that Israel has to buy the weapons at the prices that are set by the U.S. military industry. And that might not be the best price. So you have basically the U.S. Congress and the President of the United States at the time, Barack Obama, guaranteeing that Israel is buying American goods at top dollar. So it's a subsidy for the American companies. At the same time, Israel is the only country that is actively using all of this machinery and equipment, and they're providing real-time feedback to the American companies. There's a good argument to be made. And I've heard this argument being made that, the F-35s were not selling well on the open market because there's a lot of flaws with the F-35s. And yet now, after everybody sees what Israel did in the attacks against the Houthis in Yemen, and more importantly, in the 12-day war against Iran, well, guess what? Now everybody wants F-35s. When you see what Israeli pilots were able to do with the F-35, when you see what Israel was able to do to basically jimmy rig the F-35 to carry more fuel on it than the U.S. than it had when the U.S. provided that machine to the state of Israel, and now that information gets passed back to U.S. military, and they're able to upgrade and change the F-35, which makes that F-35 more marketable. And that you're talking about billions and billions of dollars in sales that now the U.S. can do because that money was given to Israel, and Israel bought those F-35s with those dollars, and then Israel souped up the F-35. So there's so much benefit that comes to the United States by giving that money to Israel. It's not a one-way street. It's not a handout. And we're not even beginning to talk about all the intelligence sharing and all of the other benefits that the United States receives as part of this military partnership.
Alex, we're almost out of time, but there's one more story we need to discuss this week. It probably would have been the top story if it wasn't for Iran and everything else going on here in the state of Israel. The government has just 1 week to pass the 2026 state budget in a first reading inside the Knesset to avoid the Knesset dissolving and Israel going towards elections. According to the Knesset legal advisor, Sagit Afik, he had a conversation with lawmakers today that a first reading must be held in the coming week because at least 2 months must pass between the first and second readings of the budget, the latter of which must be held by the end of March. In other words, to make a long story short, and it can be confusing, We have a law here in Israel. If you do not pass the state budget, then the Knesset dissolves automatically. Israel now scheduled for elections in October. But if this budget doesn't get moving and the first reading doesn't happen, and then the second and the final reading, Israel could be faced with elections here in the next, 90, 120 days instead of the last possible date, which is this coming October.
That's right. People don't understand that the Israeli system, the political system, is much different, the parliamentary system, than the American system. You don't elect a president for 4 years, and then 4 years later you have an election, and then you can get a second term. In Israel, you have a parliamentary system. A prime minister only gets elected because parties agree to be part of a coalition. The government faces no confidence motions on a monthly basis, and a government can dissolve at any time if members of the coalition decide to leave that coalition, leaving it without a majority, or if the prime minister himself pulls his own party out of the government and says it's time to go to a new election. And one of those key triggers for canceling the government is the passage of the state budget. Now, this is a budget for 2026. The deadline for passing a budget for 2026 is at the end of Q1 of 2026. So right now, Israel's kind of, and this happens all the time, it's going on like an extension of the 2025 budget. They have until the end of Q1 to pass a budget, but the Knesset legal advisor, looking at the calendar and looking at the procedural schedule and saying, if you want to get that budget passed by a second and a third reading, well, you need to have a two-month gap between that first reading and the second and the third reading, so that if you just do the math on that, they've got to pass the budget by the coalition basically in a week. So you have a potential crisis here. Now, the budget did go through the cabinet. Okay, the cabinet approved that budget already. So that's a good indication that Netanyahu has the political capital to pass that budget. But the religious parties have said that they would not vote in favor of the budget if some kind of a draft law is not passed. Now, I don't think that they would stop the process now before that first reading, because they can vote for the budget. They can vote to approve the budget in the first reading and allow it to proceed, to that deadline when it has to be ultimately passed in those second and third readings. And those can happen right around the same time. There doesn't need to be a gap between the second and the third reading. So the likelihood is that the religious parties will vote in favor of the budget now, but that you might have another crisis pushed back for about a month or 6 weeks from now. At the same time, Netanyahu could look around, and I'm certain that he's got polls running right now, and he could say, hey, the situation is good for me electorally. If he's polling very well, and if he doesn't see the opposition unified around another candidate, if he doesn't see that other parties have signed up, he might say, hey, you know what? This actually is a good time for me to go to an election. And then Netanyahu himself will just say, basically blame the religious parties for voting against the government or voting against the budget. He can just kind of like, say that he's not going to pass the law, whatever it is. You can create the scenario where some members of his government won't vote for that government. That would be a trigger for an automatic election. And that election, like you said, it would happen in about 90 days. So if Netanyahu wants there to be a snap election, this is a perfect trigger for that. The likelihood, however, is that he's going to somehow get this budget passed through the first reading, and you might see another budget crisis in about a month from now.
To be continued. Alex, from what I understand, you are traveling back to Israel this week, and you'll be back in studio finally. It's been a long time.
It has been a long time. I think we did 4 episodes in a row on the road. It's been like a 3.5 week trip. I am very, very looking forward to getting back to Jerusalem, to being with my family. But it has been a very good and productive trip for JNS. I would say here at the IAC that many people came up to me. I would say at least a dozen people that I'd never met, that recognized me and saying, hey, I'm watching your podcast all the time. So, I'm reading JNS all the time. You guys are amazing. Some people said to me, hey, are you Josh? I'm like, no, I'm not Josh. I'm Alex. They're like, oh, you do the podcast with Josh? and somebody else came up to me and they said, wow, you look so much skinnier in person than I thought. So, I don't know if you talk to Yuri and the people behind the camera about changing the framing on that, but definitely a lot of good vibes surrounding JNS here at the IAC, and you see a difference because, I've been at this conference now 7 times running, and people, we're not coming up to me with the frequency saying, oh my God, I'm reading JNS. You guys are the best. I'm watching your podcast, so informative. Somebody told me they paused the podcast to write stuff down and take notes. So many people just saying, hey, you guys are the only ones that I agree with everything you guys say. So, obviously we're doing something right. And that the legend of JNS is growing as unfortunately, probably the only truth tellers in Jewish and Israeli media. So, it's good reinforcement, sometimes good to get out on the road. We've been recruiting, partners and donors for JNS out here. Don't forget, this is a reader. It is a foundation supported, viewer supported, news agency. We're a 501c3 U.S. nonprofit, and we rely on the dollars of our readers and our viewers in order to continue creating incredible programming like this. And in 2026, we are going to increase the amount of programming, increase the quality of the programming, and that all depends on your support. We're also laying the groundwork here for the JNS Summit, which is coming up in April 15, 16, and 17 in Jerusalem at the Waldorf Astoria. It was a historic first event for us when we did it last year, featuring the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, many other ministers, 120 speakers, over 700 participants. And we are looking forward to not only replaying those successes, but actually taking it to the next level. So, people should go to jns-summit.org if they're interested in signing up for the summit, interested in learning more. I think it is going to be an important and a can't miss event. So we've made a lot of progress here on the ground. We've made a lot of progress since last year and since the beginning of October 7, but it's going to absolutely be good to be back. So looking forward to seeing you in the studio next week.
Safe travels, Alex, and we will see you, please God, next week. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank the people behind the cameras here. We have Yuri Svretsky, station manager. Our Woglanter is running the board. Ryan Lifshitz, our producer. Zach Sickerman, and another producer here, Esther Eden on JNS TV. As Alex said, make sure you go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. We'll see you next week on Jerusalem Minute.